David sat in his car, staring at the glow of the porch light. It was late, and the weariness of the day weighed heavily on his shoulders. Yet, as much as he craved the comfort of home, something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there had been an unease in his chest all day, a gnawing sensation he couldn't shake. Finally, with a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and walked to the door. As he opened it, the warm, familiar scent of roasted chicken filled the air, a meal Emily, his wife of 15 years, only made on special occasions. "David, you're home?" Emily called out from the kitchen. Her voice was cheerful, but there was a slight edge to it, like she was startled by his presence. "You sound surprised," he said, setting his briefcase down by the door. Emily appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I just didn't expect you this early, that's all. How was work?" He studied her face. She looked the same as she always did. Effortlessly beautiful, her auburn hair pulled back into a loose bun, her hazel eyes sparkling. But there was something behind her smile tonight, something guarded. "Busy," David replied. "Yours?" "Oh, the usual," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "I thought I'd make your favorite tonight. You've been working so hard lately." "You deserve it." David nodded, though the unease in his chest deepened. Emily's tone was too bright, too rehearsed. He chalked it up to his own exhaustion. Maybe he was overthinking things. They ate dinner together, chatting about mundane topics, work, the weather, the neighbor's new dog. But as the night wore on, David couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was holding something back. Later, as he loaded the dishwasher, he heard her voice coming from the office. At first, he thought she was talking to him, but when he glanced over, she wasn't there. Curious, he followed the sound of her voice, stopping just outside the door. "I can't keep this up much longer," she was saying, her voice low and urgent. "He's starting to notice." David froze. His heart began to race. Who was she talking to? What can't she keep up? He leaned closer, careful not to make a sound. "Look, I'll figure something out," Emily continued. "But you need to be patient. I can't risk him finding out." David's mind raced. Was she talking about him? What was she hiding? Suddenly, the floor creaked beneath his foot. "David!" Emily called out. Panicking, he stepped into the room, feigning nonchalance. "Hey, I thought I heard you in here. Everything okay?" Emily quickly ended the call, slipping her phone into her pocket. "Oh, just a quick work thing. Nothing important." Her smile was forced, her posture tense. David nodded slowly, though his mind was anything but calm. "Okay. Well, I'm heading to bed. Don't stay up too late." "I won't," she promised, but as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was lying. David didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Emily's whispered words looping in his mind. "I can't keep this up much longer." He's starting to notice. What did she mean? What couldn't she keep up? And who was on the other end of that call? Emily slept soundly beside him, her breathing steady and calm. To anyone else, she might have seemed perfectly innocent, but David's instincts wouldn't let him rest. Something was wrong. The following morning, Emily was up early, humming to herself as she brewed coffee and prepared breakfast. She seemed lighter than she had the night before, as though some invisible weight had been lifted. David watched her closely as he sipped his coffee, his mind swirling with unanswered questions. "Big plans at work today?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Emily glanced at him, her smile briefly faltering before she caught herself. "Oh, just the usual. Meetings, reports, you know how it is." He nodded, though her response only fueled his suspicions. Emily was a marketing manager, and while her job was demanding, she rarely spoke about it with this level of vagueness. As she kissed him goodbye and headed out the door, David felt a knot form in his stomach. He couldn't ignore it anymore, something wasn't right. Once she was gone, he paced the living room, debating his next move. He wasn't the type to invade his wife's privacy, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Emily's laptop sat on the desk in their home office, its screen dark but still powered on. With trembling hands, David opened it. Her email was already logged in. David hesitated for a moment, guilt gnawing at him. But then he thought about the call, the secrecy, the way she'd avoided his questions. Taking a deep breath, he clicked on her inbox. Most of the emails were work-related, clients, coworkers, project updates. But one email stood out. The subject line read, "Our secret plans for Friday night." David's heart raced as he opened the message. It was from someone named Greg. The email was short and cryptic. "Everything's set for Friday night. Same time, same place. Make sure he doesn't find out." Same time, same place? David thought, his pulse pounding in his ears. What is going on? He scrolled through her previous messages, finding more emails from Greg. Most of them were innocuous, meeting schedules, work updates, but there were subtle undertones that made David uneasy. Phrases like, "looking forward to seeing you again," and "let's keep this between us," jumped out at him, feeding the storm of doubt brewing in his mind. David sat back in the chair, his hands shaking. Who was Greg? And what were these plans for Friday night? He needed answers, but confronting Emily outright didn't feel like the right move. Not yet. If he was wrong, he risked damaging their marriage beyond repair. But if he was right, the thought made his chest tighten. The week dragged on, each day feeling longer than the last. Emily seemed her usual self, cheerful, attentive, and affectionate. But to David, it all felt like a facade. By Friday, he was a bundle of nerves. Emily had mentioned earlier in the week that she had to work late that night, but now he knew better. That evening, she dressed in a sleek black dress, one he hadn't seen before. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she wore the diamond earrings he had given her on their 10th anniversary. "Work event?" he asked, forcing a smile. She nodded, adjusting her necklace in the hallway mirror. "Just a client dinner. Shouldn't be too late." David nodded, though his heart was hammering in his chest. "Have fun." Emily kissed his cheek and left, the sound of her heels clicking against the floor echoing in his ears. The moment the door closed, David grabbed his coat and keys. He had memorized the address from the email and was determined to find out the truth. The address led him to an upscale restaurant downtown. From the parking lot, he spotted Emily inside, sitting at a small, candlelit table near the back. David's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't alone. Greg, a man David vaguely remembered meeting at one of Emily's office parties, sat across from her. He was tall, with neatly combed blonde hair and a confident demeanor. The two of them laughed together, their body language uncomfortably familiar. David clenched his fists, fighting the urge to storm in and confront them. He needed to know more before he acted. Through the window, he watched as Greg leaned forward, speaking in a low voice. Emily smiled, nodding in response. David's chest tightened. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but their expressions and gestures painted a picture he didn't want to see. David sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. From his vantage point in the parking lot, he could clearly see Emily and Greg through the restaurant window. They were deep in conversation, their laughter and easy smiles cutting through David like a knife. He debated his next move. Storming inside and confronting them would make a scene, but did they deserve the courtesy of privacy after all this secrecy? Still, David knew he needed to be smart. If he was wrong about what he was seeing, the damage to their relationship might be irreparable. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and searched for a better way to confirm his suspicions. He dialed his close friend and coworker, Mark. "Hey, Mark," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. "David? It's late. Everything okay?" "Not really. I need a favor. Can you help me figure out something about a guy named Greg, who works with Emily? I'll owe you one." "Greg? Let me see what I can find. Give me an hour." David hung up and turned his attention back to the restaurant. His eyes stayed locked on Emily, who was gesturing animatedly about something while Greg leaned in, hanging on her every word. The scene churned in David's stomach. What is she hiding? About 30 minutes later, Mark called back. "I found something," Mark said. Greg is listed as a senior marketing associate at Emily's firm. He's got a reputation as a bit of a charmer, smooth talker, you know the type. But there's nothing glaringly incriminating in his professional history. "Why do you ask?" David hesitated. I think he's having dinner with Emily right now. She told me she had a work event tonight, but… Mark sighed. Look, David, if you think something's going on, be careful how you approach it. Do you need me to come down there? No, I've got it, David said. Thanks, Mark. As the evening wore on, David decided to take a bolder step. He entered the restaurant, his heart pounding. Keeping his distance, he positioned himself at a table near the back, where he could hear snippets of their conversation without drawing attention to himself. Do you think he suspects anything? Greg asked, lowering his voice. Emily's laugh was soft but nervous.
No, not yet.
But we have to be careful. If David finds out about this before the announcement, it could ruin everything. David's breath caught. Announcement? What announcement? Greg nodded. We're so close, Emily. Once it's finalized, everything will fall into place. He'll understand then. David frowned. Understand what? Their words were vague but loaded, each one sinking deeper into David's chest. He struggled to make sense of it all. Were they talking about a professional project? A secret deal? Or was this some elaborate excuse to hide something far more personal? David stayed rooted to his chair, his pulse quickening with every passing second. The ambiguity was maddening. When Emily and Greg finally stood to leave, David made a split-second decision. As they exited the restaurant, he followed at a safe distance, keeping his head low. They walked to the parking lot together, their voices blending with the night air. Thank you, Greg, Emily said. This means so much to me. I couldn't have done it without you. It's a team effort, Greg replied with a smile. I'll see you on Monday. They parted ways, and Emily headed to her car. David ducked behind a nearby SUV, his heart racing. He needed answers. David watched from behind the parked SUV as Emily drove away. Greg lingered in the lot for a moment, pulling out his phone and typing something before getting into his own car. The temptation to follow Greg was strong, but David knew his priority was Emily. He returned to his car and tailed her cautiously, keeping several vehicles between them to avoid being spotted. Her route was familiar at first, heading back toward their neighborhood, but then she made an unexpected turn onto a quieter street. David's grip tightened on the wheel. Emily pulled into the parking lot of a modest office building, the kind rented out for private meetings or small events. The lights were dim inside, and the parking lot was nearly empty. David parked a few spaces away, killing the engine and sinking low in his seat. His mind raced. What is she doing here? Why didn't she come straight home? Emily stepped out of her car, glanced around nervously, and entered the building. David hesitated. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribcage. Should he confront her now? Or should he wait and see what she was doing? Steeling himself, he slipped out of his car and crept toward the building. Inside, the hallway was eerily quiet. David stayed in the shadows, listening carefully for any sound that might give him a clue. Finally, he heard Emily's voice coming from a room at the end of the hall. You really think this will work? She asked, her tone tinged with doubt. David crept closer, his steps careful and silent. It has to, another voice replied. It was Greg. We've put too much into this to let it fall apart now. Trust me, Emily, once everything is finalized, you'll be unstoppable. David's stomach churned. What could they possibly be planning? He pressed himself against the wall, peeking through the narrow gap in the door. Inside, Emily and Greg stood over a table cluttered with papers and what looked like a presentation board. Charts, graphs, and printed documents were spread out, but from David's angle, he couldn't make out the details. Emily sighed. I just hate keeping this from David. He's been so supportive of my career. He deserves to know. Greg shook his head. Not yet. We can't risk him saying anything to anyone before the announcement. This promotion is a game changer, Emily. You've worked too hard to let anything jeopardize it. Promotion. The word hit David like a freight train. He stepped back, leaning against the wall as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The late nights, the secretive calls, the cryptic emails, they weren't about an affair. They were about Emily's career. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly followed by guilt. He had doubted her, spied on her, and assumed the worst. But why hadn't she told him? Did she really think he wouldn't support her? David lingered in the hallway, torn between stepping in to explain himself and retreating before they noticed him. In the end, he chose the latter, slipping out of the building and back to his car. That night, Emily returned home as if nothing had happened. She kissed David on the cheek and asked how his evening was. Quiet, he replied, forcing a smile. But inside, his guilt festered. He had invaded her privacy and questioned her loyalty, all because he had let his insecurities get the better of him. He resolved to talk to her, but not yet. He wanted to hear her side of the story when she was ready to share it. The truth was out there now, but so was a new question. Could their relationship survive this test of trust? David woke early the next morning, the weight of guilt pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. Emily was still asleep, her expression peaceful and unguarded. He envied her serenity. Sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, David stared out the window, replaying the events of the previous night. While the pieces seemed to add up, Emily's late nights, the secretive meetings, the whispered conversations, he couldn't shake the sense of betrayal. Not because she was planning an affair, but because she hadn't trusted him enough to tell him about the promotion. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Was he being fair? Maybe Emily had her reasons. When she came downstairs later, her hair tousled and her robe wrapped snugly around her, she greeted him with a sleepy smile. "You're up early," she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, his tone neutral. Emily looked at him for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly. "Is everything okay?" David hesitated. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but the memory of her conversation with Greg held him back. She wasn't ready to tell him. "Yeah," he said finally. "Just work stress, I guess." Emily seemed to accept his answer, but the concern in her eyes lingered. Over the next few days, David tried to act normal, but the strain of keeping his suspicions hidden was taking its toll. He found himself analyzing every word Emily said, every look she gave him. It wasn't healthy, and he knew it. Finally, on Thursday evening, Emily broke the silence. "David, is something going on?" she asked as they sat on the couch, a sitcom playing in the background. "You've been distant lately?" David sighed, setting down the remote. It was time. "I should be asking you that," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. Emily blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" "You've been secretive," David said, trying to keep the accusation out of his tone. "Late nights, phone calls, meetings you don't talk about. It feels like you're hiding something from me." Emily's eyes widened, and for a moment, she didn't speak. Then she sighed, leaning back against the couch. "You're right," she admitted. "I have been hiding something. But it's not what you think." David's chest tightened. "Then what is it?" Emily hesitated, looking down at her hands. "There's a promotion coming up at work, a big one. I've been working on a project to prove I'm the right person for the job, but I wasn't sure I could pull it off. I didn't want to tell you until I was sure it was going to happen. I didn't want to disappoint you if it didn't work out." David stared at her, the relief washing over him like a wave. "Emily, why didn't you just tell me? You know I'd support you no matter what." She looked up, her eyes glistening. "Because I didn't want you to see me fail. This job means everything to me, and I couldn't bear the thought of letting you down." "Letting me down?" David echoed. "Emily, you could never let me down. I've always been proud of you, and I always will be." Tears slipped down her cheeks, and she gave a shaky laugh. "I guess I've been so focused on proving myself that I forgot what really matters." "I'm sorry, David." David reached out, taking her hand in his. "I'm sorry, too. I jumped to conclusions and let my imagination run wild. I should have trusted you." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past week finally lifting. "So," David said, a small smile tugging at his lips, "this Greg guy isn't a threat, huh?" Emily laughed, wiping her tears. "Greg?
No.
He's been helping me with the project. Trust me, you have nothing to worry about." David nodded, relief flooding through him.
Good.
"Because no one's taking you away from me." Emily smiled, leaning into him. "No one ever could." The following morning, David woke with a clearer head and a lighter heart. The tension between him and Emily had finally eased, and for the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe. Emily had left early, eager to finalize her project and prepare for the upcoming presentation that could secure her promotion. As David sipped his coffee, he reflected on their conversation from the night before. But something still nagged at him, a lingering sense that there was more to the story than Emily had shared. To quell his doubts, David decided to visit Emily's office during lunch. It wasn't to spy or accuse her of anything. He simply wanted to see her in her element and perhaps meet Greg for himself. He hoped it would put his mind at ease. When David arrived at the sleek downtown building where Emily worked, he was greeted by a cheerful receptionist who recognized him immediately. "Hi, Mr. Collins. It's so nice to see you. Are you here to see Emily's?" David nodded, smiling politely. "Yes, I thought I'd surprise her. Is she around?" The receptionist's smile faltered for a split second before she recovered. "She's actually out for lunch right now. But you're welcome to wait in the break room." David thanked her and took a seat in the break room, glancing around. The walls were decorated with motivational posters, and a few employees were chatting quietly by the coffee machine. As he waited, he overheard snippets of their conversation. "She's been working so hard on that pitch. If anyone deserves the promotion, it's Emily." "Totally. But Greg's been acting a little off lately, don't you think? Like he knows something we don't." David's ears perked up. He tried not to react, but his curiosity was piqued. What could Greg possibly know that had people talking? Emily returned to the office about 20 minutes later, her face lighting up when she saw David. "What are you doing here?" she asked, a smile spreading across her face. "I thought I'd surprise you," David said, standing to greet her. "I just wanted to see where all the magic happens." Emily laughed. "Well, you picked a good day. I just finished rehearsing my pitch for the final presentation. Do you want a sneak peek?" David nodded eagerly, following her to the conference room. Inside, Emily walked him through her proposal, her confidence and passion shining through with every word. David couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as he watched her. When she finished, he applauded. "That was incredible, Emily. They'd be fools not to give you the promotion." She beamed, her cheeks flushing. "Thank you. That means so much to me." As they left the conference room, Greg appeared in the hallway. His eyes flicked to David, then back to Emily, his expression unreadable. "Emily, can I talk to you for a moment?" Greg asked. Emily glanced at David, then back at Greg. "Of course." "David, I'll be right back." David nodded, though he couldn't ignore the unease settling in his chest. David waited in the hallway, but as minutes passed, his curiosity got the better of him. He moved closer to the office where Emily and Greg were talking, their voices muffled, but just audible enough to make out snippets. "You're making a mistake, Emily," Greg said, his tone low but firm. "You're putting too much faith in them. This company doesn't reward loyalty. They reward strategy." "What are you saying, Greggs?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "I'm saying you need to protect yourself," Greg replied. "If you don't, someone else will take that promotion right out from under you. Trust me, I've seen it happen." Emily's voice grew sharper. "I'm not going to sabotage anyone, Greg. I've worked hard for this, and I'll earn it the right way." Greg sighed. "Just think about it, okay? I don't want to see you get hurt." David stepped back, his heart pounding. Greg's words carried a sense of foreboding, but Emily's response filled him with admiration. She wasn't just talented, she was principled. When Emily rejoined David a few minutes later, she seemed composed, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Everything okay?" David asked gently. "Yeah," she said, nodding. "Just work stuff. Let's go grab some lunch." As they walked to a nearby cafe, David couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. Emily might not see Greg's intentions clearly, but David did. Greg wasn't just a colleague, he was a threat. The final presentation day arrived with a mixture of anticipation and tension. Emily left early, dressed sharply and radiating determination. David, sensing the weight of the day for her, gave her an encouraging hug and wished her luck. "Go get what you deserve," he said, meaning every word. She smiled, though there was a flicker of anxiety in her eyes. "Thank you. I'll see you tonight." David watched her drive away, determined that tonight, their relationship would finally find the resolution it needed, whether it was rebuilding trust or facing difficult truths. That afternoon, David received an unexpected call. "David, it's Mark," his coworker and confidant said. "I did a bit more digging on Greg after our last chat. Something seemed off about him." David frowned. "What did you find?" "Greg has a history of sabotaging colleagues to climb the corporate ladder. He's been involved in several office conflicts, always under the radar, but enough to paint a clear picture. He's not just charming. He's calculating." David's stomach twisted. He thanked Mark and hung up, now more concerned than ever for Emily. As the evening wore on, David waited anxiously for Emily's return. She finally walked through the door, her expression unreadable. "Hey," he said carefully. "How did it go?" She hesitated, setting her bag down before meeting his gaze. "I got the promotion." David's face broke into a smile, but Emily's somber tone gave him pause. "That's amazing, Emily. You earned it. But you don't seem happy." She sank onto the couch, running a hand through her hair. "Because I found out something disturbing today, and it's been eating at me." David sat beside her, waiting silently. "After my presentation, I overheard Greg talking to one of the senior managers," she said. "He was trying to plant doubts about my ability to lead, saying I wasn't ready for the position. He wanted them to reconsider the decision before it was announced." David's jaw tightened. "That's low. What did you do?" Emily's eyes flashed with determination. "I confronted him. I told him I knew what he was doing and that if he didn't stop, I'd report his behavior to HR. He tried to deny it, but the manager heard enough to question his credibility." "Good," David said firmly. "You don't deserve to deal with people like him." Emily nodded, though her shoulders sagged with exhaustion. "I thought Greg was helping me, but he was just using me to advance his own agenda. I feel so stupid for trusting him." "You're not stupid," David said, taking her hand. "You're driven, talented, and kind. Greg saw that as a weakness, but it's your greatest strength." Her eyes glistened, and she gave him a small smile. "Thank you, David. I don't know what I'd do without you." Later that evening, as they sat together in the quiet of their living room, Emily reached for David's hand again. "There's something I need to say," she began. "I should have been honest with you from the start. Keeping the promotion a secret was a mistake. I was so scared of failing that I forgot how much you believe in me." David nodded. "And I need to apologize too. I doubted you, Emily. I let my own insecurities get the better of me, and I didn't trust you when I should have." She squeezed his hand. "We've been through a lot these past few weeks, but I think we're stronger for it." David smiled. "I know we are." As the days turned into weeks, Emily thrived in her new role, her confidence growing with each success. David stood by her side, their relationship now rooted in honesty and mutual support. The experience had tested them, but it had also taught them the value of communication and trust. And as they sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset, David couldn't help but feel grateful for the storm they had weathered. Because in the end, their bond had not only survived, it had grown unshakable. Please share your comments here and subscribe and share.